So there was a UK Daily Mail update about a smoking gun, a dossier, where it looks like this is the Trump crackdown that's going on against a bunch of NGOs. That looks like the George Soros Foundation may have spent at least $80 million on different groups who have actively engaged in terrorism here in the States. And of course, for those who may not know, George Soros, he is the bogeyman of the right. And it's through his foundation, the Open Society Foundations. And I think they have like $30 billion in that network. But anyway, so it could be trouble, not just for him, but also for his son. So let's jump right into this. This is the UK Daily Mail. Smoking gun, they write, that could bring down George Soros as damning dossier of evidence is piling up against him is revealed. Progressive billionaire George Soros and his $32 billion Open Society Foundations, or the OSF, are facing the most serious threat in their decades-long history. This comes as the Justice Department drew up plans last week to investigate the liberal funding giant for everything from arson to material support for of terrorism, which, by the way, they could be looking at RICO charges, depending where this goes. So let's see what they got to say. Now, speaking exclusively with the Daily Mail, Ryan Mauro, or whatever, an investigator with the Conservative Capital Research Center, or the CRC, said the evidence against Soros, who is now 95 years old, was already hiding in plain sight. And prosecutors now have the tools to uncover what he called a smoking gun that has yet to be fully discovered. It could be an undisclosed bank transaction, it could be a communication, it could be classified intelligence that just hasn't been shared in the right way, but it's already there. Mauro and his team recently published a bombshell report alleging that Soros-funded foundation has funneled more than $80 million into group linked to terrorism and extremist violence. Now, that exhaustive 90-page dossier has already been cited by senior DOJ official Akash Singh as evidence for possible criminal charges. Among the groups named by CRC were the Center for Third World Organizing and its militant partner, the Ruckus Society, which reportedly trained activists in sabotaging during the 2020 George Floyd riots, which would be a problem. These are the violent a-holes that were out there burning down cities, and a lot of people died. There was I think there was over 24 people died during the 2020 George Floyd riots. Now, another recipient, the Sunrise Movement, endorsed the Antifa-linked Stop Cop City campaign in Atlanta, where dozens of activists now face terrorism and racketeering charges. Mauro also alleged that OSF pumped $18 million into the movement for Black Lives Matters, members of which have showed support for Hamas and also tearing down the U.S. and turning us into a communist utopia, and another $2 million into Al-Haq, a Palestinian rights group that critics say supports terrorists, a charge, of course, that the OSF is denying. Let's see. Now, liberal megadonor George Soros and his son and heir, Alex, this is the young man right here behind, facing scrutiny in the DOJ's probe about everything from arson to material support of terrorism. Soros's money has flowed to the Antifa-linked Stop Cop City protests that saw buildings vandalized and Atlanta police vehicles set ablaze. Mauro said that a decision has been made by Soros' group to continue financing organizations linked to foreign terrorist groups and domestic terrorism, even though people know about it. And Mauro is warning that such activity crosses a line. You don't say. That seems rather obvious to me. He said, if I give an organization or individuals money to engage in a crime, I am complicit. Ding, ding, ding. This is why the terrorism label for Antifa was so important. It was setting the stage for a trap by the Trump administration for the Soros organization, for the OSF. Mauro goes on to say that some of these groups are so blatantly engaged in criminal activity that it does step over the line from opinion into actual conspiracy. And according to the New York Times, Singh has instructed more than half a dozen U.S. attorneys to explore charges against OSF, ranging from racketeering and wire fraud to arson and material support for terrorism. This does not look good for the OSF. The Soros Foundation did not answer requests for comment on Mauro's report, you don't say, but the group has strongly countered the claims raised by the Justice Department probe. The OSF said in a statement that these accusations are politically motivated attacks on civil society meant to silence speech the administration disagrees with and undermine the First Amendment right to free speech. Well, I think you have a problem when your so-called right to free speech is incitement of violence and or funding terrorist organizations. Let's see. Now, the group insisted that it unequivocally condemns terrorism, even though it apparently is supporting it financially, and that its activities are peaceful and lawful. Soros, the Hungarian-born hedge fund tycoon, who, by the way, is a U.S. citizen, funded OSF decades ago to support democracy movements in communist and post-communist countries. Yeah, this guy is definitely not supporting democracy. By the 1990s, it had expanded into the United States, where it bankrolls progressive causes from racial justice to climate activism. That record has made Soros a villain to the American right, accused of masterminding unrest and violent protests through a sprawling web of nonprofits. Let's see. Now, in 2023, Soros handed control of the OSF to his son, who is 39 years old, who has pledged to step up the fight against the calls, or what he calls authoritarianism at home and abroad. But Mauro, or whatever, warned that Alex, who married Hillary Clinton aide Huma Abedin, I didn't know that, in a lavish Hamptons wedding, why does that matter, may have inherited more than just a funding empire. The OSF website itself admits that it didn't disclose everything. If disclosing grants would endanger a grantee or the foundation, they keep it a secret. So what we've uncovered is just what they're uncomfortable telling the world. Now, the DOJ probe comes at a fraught political moment, as President Trump has repeatedly demanded Soros be jailed, branding him an enemy of the American people. The Times reported that Singh's memo instructs prosecutors to treat the Soros case as a priority, in a stark break from decades of practice meant to shield the DOJ from political interference. Mauro believes that Soros' probe will just be the start of a sweeping effort against America's network of non-organization or governmental organizations, and indeed it will. There's been too much violence, there's been too many protests, too many riots that have had funding from NGOs. Think about how many times we've seen riots and protests, say in LA, where everyone magically has signs, flags, uniforms. How does that happen? Well, that comes from funding. They're getting the money from somewhere. And you're going to have organizations like the OSF that would be part of that. And when you have groups that are actively trying to undermine democracy, undermine our representative republic, and undermine our way of life in general, this is an existential threat that you got to look into. So if it turns out that they nail this guy, I'm not going to feel bad about it. Let's see. Now, Mauro goes on to say that there's a real safe harbor for terrorism and extremism within the American nonprofit sector, and you have an entire infrastructure with unimaginable amount of wealth exploiting that. Sarasota locked the SOB up forever. Look, if he's been funding terrorism, yeah. And what's nice is, I'm not nice, but I wonder, because he has American citizenship, is that going to make it easier to get him? I don't know. I got to look into this. Now, let's see. Police, when pro-terrorist groups organize and fundraise on Iranian soil, we call it state sponsorship of terror. When the same thing happens on U.S. soil in the nonprofit sector, we call it charity. For Soros and his son, the stakes could not be higher. If federal prosecutors follow Singh's roadmap, they may soon face an unprecedented criminal trial. This is a new day, Mauro said. We are not going back to the way it was before. So, I guess let's ask the obvious question. What does this mean for our good old friend and ally, George Soros and son? Well, for Soros, I think it's pretty obvious the stakes are high. Now, he's an old man, but his son is also in trouble. And because he's a major donor and his son has taken personal ownership and accountability of the OSF, which means that the son could face liability if the prosecutors could prove intent or complicity, right, in funding these potentially illegal activities. So they could be screwed because the federal government, I think, will be looking to find evidence, for example, of undisclosed transactions, communications, or material support of terrorist organizations, aka Antifa. You could be looking at racketeering, RICO charges, right, which is how they took down the mob. So the Soros boys, George and his son Alex, could be in huge trouble. And I wonder how many other groups are funded by other philanthropists, let's just say, around the globe that they could go after as well. And with Trump and his DOJ directly focusing on George Soros, this would not surprise me at all if the hammer comes down. So I don't know. I mean, we're in uncharted territory. And I'll be honest, prior to this election cycle, I just, the idea of law and order directly going after some of these people, it just seemed like an ethereal wish that was never going to happen. And yet we see the indictment of James Comey. And I mean, he's looking at minimum with the first 2 charges at potentially 10 years in jail. And believe me, they will find other things to tack onto this as their investigation goes on. So he's kind of screwed as well. So I think we might actually see real accountability. For the first time in our lives, the right is actually going to use the tools of our Justice Department to go after criminal behavior. I mean, what is this? How did this happen? What timeline are we in? What alternate universe? I'm genuinely surprised and encouraged to see that law and order actually might mean something again, because it hasn't for a very, very long time. But I guess when you, as the president, who is the head of the DOJ, the head of all he is the ultimate lawman in the U.S., when he's been shot at, physically wounded by an assassin, and they attempted to jail him. There's been lawsuits against him, and now his good friend Charlie Kirk murdered. I guess maybe that would put a fire under your butt to do something about this. So what we could see here, if this probe finds enough evidence, you could expect RICO charges that would completely dismantle OSF, and potentially maybe some criminal charges for Mr. George Soros and son. So what a world, right? That would be amazing to see.